And next we have going to get the paper name. Galatians 2 and Acts 16, the group marker Greek and circumcision by Dennis Lutero.
Good morning. Good morning. Let me get this shared out for everybody. And let me know if you can see that okay. Can you all hear me and see the screen? All right, I got thumbs up. Thanks, James. All right, good morning. I'd like to explore with you the use of the group marker Greek or Greeks as it's used in the New Testament, specifically as we find it in Acts 16 verses 1 and 3 and Galatians 2 verse 3, to see how we might use the practice of circumcision to better understand the use of this group marker Greek, which is traditionally considered synonymous with the term Gentile, by analyzing these two passages together. What I hope to accomplish in the next 10 minutes or so, first to recognize the fabulous work of Jason Staples in his book, The Idea of Israel, where he shows that the terms Judaios, Jew, and Israel are not synonymous, and in so doing, suggests that in a similar way, the term ethnos, translated alternately as Gentiles or nations, and the term Ελλην, Greek, should no longer be considered synonymous. And second, to convince you of the possibility that the term Greek is often used in the New Testament as an intra-Israelite group marker that refers to non-Jewish Israelites, most likely from the former Northern Kingdom of Israel. If you're not familiar with Jason's 2021 monograph, The Idea of Israel and Second Temple Judaism, I highly recommend it. It's groundbreaking, comprehensive, and I would say without hyperbole that it should change the face of biblical studies. In this book, Staples analyzes the Old Testament and the extant catalog of Second Temple period literature, definitively showing that the term Israel is used in one of three ways. One, to refer to ancient Israel, all 12 tribes, in the united monarchy. Two, to refer to the Northern Kingdom of Israel in the divided monarchy. And three, to refer to a reunited Israel, again, all 12 tribes, in the eschatological future. Two corollaries come out of this. One, Israel is never used as a synonym for Judah, Jews, or Judaism. And two, the Hebrew Bible never portrays Jews, Judah, as the new Israel. With this understanding in place, one question that presents itself is, if Jews is not used during this period as synonymous with Israel, how are non-Jewish Israelites accounted for in the literature? I ask you to keep this question in mind as we turn our discussion to circumcision. As we begin to consider the Apostle Paul's stance on Gentile circumcision, it is noteworthy that each of the scholars listed here affirms that the views of Gentile circumcision within the Jewish/Israelite covenant community are many and varied. So, what did Paul believe about and practice? That Gentiles should not be circumcised, because the rite did not have the power to turn Gentiles into Jews. Since then, Paul argued against Gentile circumcision. What are we to make of the circumcision of Timothy? Should we see in slide 8 here, Nanos indicates that Timothy is a Jew, presumably based on his matrilineal descent. Thiessen states that Timothy could be considered either a Jew or a Gentile, and says that, quote, Luke shows how careful Paul is to require circumcision in this sort of liminal case. Liminal indeed. I will use the same term a little later, but with a different spin. Fredrickson debunks any Jewish acceptance of a matrilineal descent, stating that a child of a Gentile father and a Jewish mother would be a non-Jew. Then goes on to admit that Acts 16, 1 through 3 has confounded commentators. Ryan Coleman writes, it seems that Paul would have deemed Timothy to be a Jew, or at least Jewish. All four authors accept the tension of the passage, noting the inconsistencies, and move on. Now we turn to our second passage under consideration, Galatians 2, 1 through 3, and specifically verse 3, which marks Titus as a quote-unquote Greek. How do contemporary scholars understand Titus's Greekness? Nanos, Frederickson, and Coleman definitively assume that Titus is a Gentile based on the group marker Greek, without further discussion. Each one wrestles with the fact of the circumcision controversy in Galatians 2 in their own way, but all three accept as given Titus's Gentileness without question. I have two thought experiments in this presentation, but due to time constraints, I must skip them for now. I may actually do the second one, we'll see. I will include them in the updated slides and notes for the presentation, and perhaps we can discuss during Q&A. There's the first thought experiment. I'll skip over that. Now let's take a look at our two passages again. What information can we garner by analyzing these two passages together? In the case of Timothy, Paul has Timothy circumcised because, quote, they, the Jews, all knew his father was Greek. In the case of Titus, Paul's refusal to have Titus circumcised is set against the fact that Titus is Greek. Not even Titus being a Greek. In both cases, there is an expectation that Greeks are meant to be circumcised, contra the expectation of circumcision held for Gentiles, an exception set for Gentiles in Acts 15 at the Jerusalem Council. Because of the expectation of circumcision, Timothy and Titus must be some sort of Israelite. Thus, our first conclusion: Greeks are Israelites in some sense. Genealogically Israelites, physically descended from one of the 12 tribes of Israel, who by blood rights belong to the covenant, but who are not practicing their ancestral religion in the same way as the Jews, spanning the spectrum from worshiping Yahweh to worshiping other gods and idols and everything in between. This leads to our second conclusion: Greeks are not Gentiles, again, in some sense. As ethnic Israelites, they are part of the diaspora, living in the nations while never becoming the nations, and yet following the cultural norms of the nations where they reside in a variety of ways and to varying degrees. Let's unpack this a little more. We know from Jason Staples' work that the group marker Jew was not used in the Second Temple period to refer to all Israelites, but rather only to those Israelites from the tribe of Judah, from the Southern Kingdom of Judah, or to those who practiced the Israelite religion in the way of the Jews from those regions. So how do we refer to the rest of Israel? Well, the remainder of the tribes come from what was the Northern Kingdom of Israel, so we can just call them Israelites, right? No, this won't work. We have reference to Samaritans in the New Testament, indicating Samaria, once the capital of the Northern Kingdom, but its usage seems limited to a subset of non-Jewish Israelites, similar to the terms Pharisees and Essenes within the Jewish community. My proposal is that the term Greek, in most instances of its usage in the New Testament and other early Christian documents, refers to Northern Kingdom Israelites, with all the porosity and heterogeneity that we encounter with the term Jew. Built into this term Greek is the idea of dispersion or diaspora. Strangers in strange lands, Israelites no longer tied to their ancestral land. They had to make decisions on whether to continue to live as Israelites, far from their temple cult, or adapt their practices by adopting the cultures of their new homes. Some probably looked very much like their Jewish siblings. Others became syncretistic. Still others completely assimilated into their new culture, looking and sounding very much, quote-unquote, Gentile. But they still carried the blood of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Are they still Israelites? Genealogically, yes. In terms of praxis, maybe not. Do we then call them Gentiles? Ethne? They live in the nations. They act like the nations. But just as Gentiles can never truly become Jews/Israelites, so also Israelites can never fully become Gentiles. As someone myself who is half Filipino, I know what it is like to not be Filipino enough to be considered a true Filipino by full-blooded Filipinos, and not white enough to be fully part of that culture. Cultural identity is complex, and even more so for those of us who are part of a diaspora community. The bottom line, however, is that you need some way to refer to these people who live in that liminal space between cultures. I believe the New Testament writers, echoing the language of the day, used the term Greek to refer to non-Jewish Israelites from the former Northern Kingdom of Israel living among the nations. So, to bolster this claim, let's look at three modern-day analogs. These three terms, Ashkenazim, Sephardim, Mizrahim, all originate as place and or people group names in the Hebrew language, and yet Jews/Israelites use them today to refer to people living in those regions. So let me, I think I've got the time. Let me go ahead and run through this second thought experiment. So you should see slide 16. So I conclude with the second thought experiment. Let's talk about the phrase Jew and Greek, found predominantly in Paul's letters, most notably Romans, but also found in Acts in the plural, Jews and Greeks. This phrase is traditionally understood as a metonym for all the people of the world. I suggest, given the work of Jason Staples and the argument I have presented today, that we can no longer interpret this phrase in this way. If Jew does not equal Israel, and if Greek does not equal Gentile, then the phrase Jew and Greek does not equal all people. Here on slide 17, we see a graphical representation of the traditional view where Jew and Greek represent the whole world. On slide 18, however, we see that after Staples, the phrase Jew and Greek makes more sense, not as a universe of all people, but as the covenant universe of all Israel. Therefore, the terms Jew and Greek should be considered as intra-Israelite group markers, differentiating between the northern and southern kingdoms. Thus, to represent all people, we need not two, but three group markers: Jews, Greeks, and Gentiles. In conclusion, in addition to recognizing that there are three primary subsets of people in the New Testament, we need to re-examine our exegesis of the term Greek throughout the New Testament. Also, I suggest that as we do this, there are other group markers that may warrant a re-examination as intra-Israelite differentiators, as opposed to universally applied terms. I didn't put it here on the slide, but I'm thinking of Ryan Coleman's work on the circumcised versus foreskinned, and just the complexities involved with that. And that is my presentation. Thank you for your time and the consideration of this material.
Thank you. Oh, looks like we do have a question coming up in the chat. So let's go again to those in attendance. If you have a question, please put it into the chat, and then we'll try to get it into the Q&A. We do have a good amount of time for Q&A. So, Trista, do we want to let Andrew Perriman in to ask his question? Mr. Perriman, you're welcome to state your question yourself, or if you wish somebody else to speak it for you, you can just say in the chat, just read my question or something like that. Okay, I will go ahead and read it.
Yeah, I'm taking a look at his question here, James. Does this work for Romans 1:18 through 32, which seems to treat Greek as a uniformly pagan in religion and practice? Why shouldn't Paul simply be speaking of the Greek world in which he had pursued his mission thus far? This is a great question. Again, if you take as a foundation just that logic chain of Israel and Jew not being synonymous, Greek and Gentile not being synonymous. I mean, you can no longer use Jew and Greek as a universal term if Jew does not represent all of Israel. So you've got to do something with that. I will say, I didn't say it in my paper, but this is just one facet of the work that I've been doing over the last 4 years on not only the term Greek, but also working in Romans as I to the Romans' performance. And there are a lot of other things we can talk about at length. See if I can do this in a nutshell. For Romans 1:18-32, I subscribe to Doug Campbell's reading of this as a prosopopoeia. And if you look at the language in 18-32, there are reference to Northern Kingdom specific issues. So instead of reading that universally, Romans 1:23 is where you see the animals listed. You make graven images in the form of birds and animals and creeping things. The only other place that you find that in the Bible is in Hosea, which is interesting that no one's picked up on that. We've got Hosea later in Romans in chapter 9. But here in chapter 1 is a referent where that sequence of animals happens 3 times in Hosea, and that's all in the discussion about the apostasy of the Northern Kingdom. And there are a couple others within there, but again, for time, that's probably the highlight. Fredrickson talks about how Jews were the ones who knew God, and that Gentiles did not know God. And so right at the beginning of 1:18, you have that reference to they knew God, but they did not honor him or give thanks to him as God. And so I think we can, I guess part of my argument is to say that the Romans itself is an intra-Israelite debate.
A question that is related but slightly outside the scope of your paper. Curious, how does renegotiating this language, understanding it this way, change your understanding of the conflict between Paul and his competitors, sometimes called Judaizers traditionally by certain people? But that group, what's the nature of the conflict there given this language?
I'm still wrestling with whether those are just Jews that are insisting upon the circumcision of other Israelites who, again, as covenant people, should take on the whole law, or if they are Judaizers in the sense that they are people that have that are proselytes, again, from the Northern Kingdom, who have then have just gotten a little bit too big for their britches. I think it can be read both ways, but I do see that as more a focus on how do we get our covenant siblings to follow the law they should have been following all along.
Thank you. So I don't see any more in the chat, so I think we're going to move on. Thank you so much, Dennis, for your presentation. Very clear. And yeah, appreciate it. And a lot to think about. And thanks for the book reference, something to go read next. So next we have Unexpected Toleration, analyzing John 19:39-42.